Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says Russian strikes have left some 4.5 million people without power across the country. Zelenskyy accuses Moscow of energy terrorism for escalating attacks on Ukraine's power grid as winter looms. Similar attacks on infrastructure have also damaged Ukraine's water supplies. Officials have asked refugees not to return to the country this winter because of fears of further shortages. Joining me from Kyiv is DW correspondent Nick Connolly. Nick, just how challenging is it trying to get the power back up after these airstrikes?
I think it's getting more difficult every time. Simply, it's an issue of spare parts running out. The authorities here say they're now totally dependent on supplies of this equipment coming in from abroad. If there are more rocket attacks from Russia, which we're expecting to be the case. This morning we heard from the mayor of Kyiv that about 500,000 people here or 500,000 households here in the capital are without power. That's on top of the planned outages. People here have a schedule, and about 12 hours in every 24 are going to be without power. It's kind of organised in a way to allow people to kind of go about their daily lives, but it's not fully always accurate, and there is a sense that people are now talking about generators. When you're just on the street, you kind of hear snatched conversation of people for the first time trying to get their heads around what it would be like if it's realistic. Are they going to be able to get diesel to run those generators? Can you put it on your balcony? So it's basically a whole new situation here, and a real sense among people that as winter comes and temperatures are now finally dropping, that this is going to get a lot worse and be a lot less comfortable for people before things really improve.
What about these claims from Moscow that Kyiv was developing a so-called dirty bomb? The International Atomic Energy Agency has found no evidence of that. What was behind the claims?
Well, this looks a lot like just another part of the kind of Russian disinformation strategy. You might remember at the beginning of the war, there was a lot of talk from Moscow about Ukraine having so-called biolaboratories, US money flowing to Ukraine to supposedly produce biological weapons. No evidence on that account was ever provided. I think this is about basically creating a bit of noise, distracting from lots of Russia's defeats on the battlefield for the kind of internal Russian audience, but also internationally. It's about just creating fear in the same way that those kind of constant attacks and fighting around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's biggest, it all just basically creates kind of climate of fear where people maybe who aren't that invested, who aren't following the story here in Ukraine too closely, will just get cold feet, will be worried about the kind of consequences of all this for themselves, even if the real risk isn't necessarily there, and will potentially put pressure on their governments to kind of reduce support for Ukraine. So this is basically just another red herring that's out there, and I think it's not going to be the last. We've seen time and time again lots of kind of often mutually exclusive explanations of things coming out of Moscow, and then a few days later the kind of all talk about these things is then dropped. So there's no real kind of sense that it's really worth logically trying to kind of take these apart. They're just kind of part of war, part of the kind of propaganda war, and as such it's just part of kind of a bigger attempt to get people to kind of be scared about all this and to make people believe that Ukraine doesn't really have a chance of winning this war.
Nick Connolly on the information war and the mass power outages across parts of Ukraine. Thank you very much for bringing us up to date. And let's get more now on the fighting from our Russia analyst, Konstantin Egert. He joins us from Tallinn. Konstantin, there are signs the Russians are withdrawing from parts of Kherson. Can you tell us why?
Well, I suppose that the Russian commanders, they understand that this battle may well soon be lost. And I suppose that what they want to avoid is this accusations of leaving the quote-unquote Russians, because of course, this operation in the Kremlin parlance was all about liberating Russians in Ukraine, leaving them alone. Depopulation is important for the Kremlin, transfer of population, to use the euphemistic term, because A, it proves to the world, it is supposed to prove, that Russians are really afraid of Ukrainians, that all those people were really liberated and they're running away. Secondly, it replenishes the Russian workforce reservoir. And thirdly, leaves the positions, leaves the area more or less free to fight for whichever Russian forces will remain there. So I think there are three reasons for that.
And where would it place Ukraine strategically if it did recapture the city of Kherson, for example?
It will be a very important win because it's a major city. It's more important than, let's say, the city of Liman that was recaptured earlier. it is to some extent not the only gateway to the Crimea, but is one of the gateways. The Kherson Oblast has one of the most important pumps pumping water, or which is supposed to pump water to the Crimea. Again, not the only one, but because it is probably the biggest city that Ukraine will recapture in the last 2-3 months, it will be also a very visible public relations victory, if you wish. It's going to be very convincing for the Ukrainian public and for the world that the Ukrainian armed forces can really achieve very significant feats. It will also complicate the situation in the Crimea, although it will not completely cut it off from Russia.
And tell us more about what's happening with all of these residents of the eastern and southern provinces who are being relocated.
Well, it seems, and there are lots of reports from independent Russian journalists, from observers, from the NGOs, that these people usually basically either are taken to some kind of holding areas, let's put it like that, or actually because quite a few of them already have Russian passports, especially from the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, but Kherson less so. They just disperse in Russia, look for work. What is concerning is the fate of children from the orphanages in Ukraine. They are being reported to be basically transferred to Russia and then being given up for adoption, so they would become essentially Russian citizens or Russians. So I think this is one thing that's been constantly in the media, and which was of concern, of course, is of concern, because this constitutes definitely a very significant human rights violation.
Ripped from Ukraine by their aggressors, Russian aggressors, and then forced to grow up in a Russian family. That is certainly really worrying for those kids. Konstantin Egad, thank you very much.
Thank you, bye.